Have you ever risked everything to save someone who couldn't save themselves? Imagine choosing between your job, your home, and a life hanging in the balance. That's exactly what happened to Jake Callahan when he discovered a champion horse left to die. This isn't just another rescue story. It's a battle against power, corruption, and a man with nothing left to lose except his father's most important lesson. In the next few minutes, you'll see how one decision sparked a David versus Goliath showdown that changed an entire community. The moment when those men show up during the storm will leave you breathless. Hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Are you a horse lover or someone who believes in standing up for what's right? Let's dive into the incredible story of Second Chance Ranch. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Callahan's shoulders as he guided the rusty pitchfork through another heap of hay. At 18, his body was already hardened by years of ranch work, shoulders broad beneath his faded plaid shirt, hands calloused and strong, face tanned and weathered beyond his years. Only his eyes, a striking deep blue that mirrored the Texas sky, betrayed his youth, though they carried a weariness that came from growing up too fast. "Callahan, you ain't finished with that east paddock yet." Mr. Blackwell's gruff voice carried across the dusty yard of the Rockingbee Ranch, cutting through the heavy summer air. "Almost done, sir," Jake called back, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana that had once been red but was now a faded rust color from years of use and sun exposure. "Just need another hour. Make it 30 minutes. Got another job waiting after that," Blackwell replied, disappearing into the barn with a dismissive wave. Jake sighed, adjusting his worn cowboy hat. 3 years since his parents' accident, and days like this still made him wonder how his life had veered so far off course. The old pickup truck that had belonged to his father sat parked by his small rented cabin on the edge of Clearwater, Texas. Population 2,453 and shrinking every year as young folks sought opportunities in Houston or Dallas. "Your daddy was the best horseman in 3 counties," old-timers would tell him when he stopped by Miller's General Store for supplies. That man could gentle a Mustang with just his voice. Such a damn shame what happened. The memory of his father, Thomas Callahan, astride his chestnut stallion, Redemption, was one Jake clung to on the hardest days. His mother, Sarah, with her warm smile and the smell of fresh-baked cornbread that seemed to follow her everywhere. These memories were both comfort and torment. Later that evening, Jake sat on the worn steps of his cabin, counting the meager bills from his week's pay. After rent, gas for the truck, and the minimum payment on his parents' medical bills that the insurance hadn't covered, he had barely enough for groceries. "Gonna be beans again this week, Rusty," he told the aging border collie that had been his father's loyal companion and was now his only family. The dog rested his graying muzzle on Jake's knee, eyes understanding in a way only a faithful dog's could be. Inside, the cabin was sparse but meticulously clean, his mother's influence. A few photographs hung on the wall, his parents on their wedding day, his father winning the regional rodeo championship, and a family photo taken on Jake's 16th birthday, just 3 months before the accident on Route 87 that left him alone in the world. Jake pulled out his father's journal from the bedside drawer, worn leather with pages filled with wisdom about horses, life, and integrity. "A true horseman listens to the animal," his father had written. "They speak with their eyes, their ears, their whole being. Respect that language, and there's no horse that won't trust you in return." As he drifted to sleep that night, Jake thought of his father's words and the life he'd envisioned for himself. College maybe, taking over the small breeding operation his parents had started. Dreams that now seemed as distant as the stars visible through his window. One day at a time, he whispered to himself, an incantation against despair. Just like Dad always said, one day at a time. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another day of labor, another step in the long journey of survival. But somewhere in his heart, beneath the weight of responsibility and grief, a tiny ember of his father's spirit remained, waiting for the right moment to spark back into flame. The Clearwater County Livestock Fair was in full swing when Jake arrived early Saturday morning. Mr. Blackwell had sent him with $500 in cash and strict instructions to find a healthy, young dairy cow at a bargain price. The fairgrounds buzzed with activity, farmers haggling over prices, children chasing each other between animal pens, and the scent of fried food mingling with the earthy smell of livestock. Keep it under $450 if you can, Blackwell had told him. And don't you dare come back with anything fancy. Just need something practical that gives good milk. Jake nodded, clutching the envelope of cash. This was a test, he knew. Blackwell rarely trusted anyone with this much money or responsibility. Making his way through the crowded fairgrounds, Jake meticulously inspected several dairy cows, jotting down prices and conditions in a small notepad. He was about to close a deal on a young Jersey heifer when commotion from the horse section caught his attention. Worthless nag. A man's voice boomed over the general buzz. $200, and I'm practically giving her away. Something in the harsh tone pulled Jake away from the cattle pens. Following the sound, he found himself at a small corral where a group of men had gathered around a painfully thin white mare. The horse stood with her head hanging low, ribs clearly visible beneath a dull coat that might once have been brilliant white. Her eyes, though, they caught Jake instantly. Deep, intelligent eyes that watched the men warily. Excuse me. Jake pushed his way through the crowd. What's her story? The seller, a heavy-set man with a weathered face and cold eyes, spat tobacco juice on the ground. This here's Lady Lightning. Used to be a champion barrel racer 3 years back. One more buckles than I can count. He gestured dismissively. Got temperamental. Ain't worth the feed now. Jake approached the fence. The mare's stall was barely large enough for her to turn around, and an empty water bucket lay on its side. When he moved closer, she flinched, revealing old whip marks across her flank. She's been abused, Jake said softly, not as a question. The seller's eyes narrowed. She's been handled, boy. Some horses need a firm hand. An older man in the crowd spoke up. I remember this mare. Clayton family owned her before. She was something to see back then. She's lame now, someone else chimed in. Look at how she favors that left hind leg. Jake studied the mare carefully. The leg didn't look permanently damaged to his trained eye, more like the result of neglect and poor shoeing. He recalled his father's lessons about recognizing potential in a troubled horse. 200, Jake asked, his heart hammering. Mr. Blackwell would fire him on the spot. Cash in hand. The seller confirmed, already reaching for the money. Jake hesitated, his father's voice echoing in his memory. The measure of a man isn't in how he treats those who can help him, but in how he treats those who can't. I'll take her, Jake said firmly, pulling $200 from the envelope. You're throwing your money away, kid, a bystander commented. That horse is one step from the glue factory. The seller laughed. No refunds when you figure out she's worthless. As Jake signed the hasty bill of sale, the mare raised her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. Something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or the faintest flicker of hope. What are you calling her? The seller asked mockingly as he counted the bills. Jake thought for a moment, looking at the mare whose white coat seemed to capture and hold what little light reached the dingy stall. Stella, he said quietly. Her name is Stella. Leading the mare carefully from the pen, Jake realized he still had $300 of Blackwell's money and no cow. His future at the ranch, his ability to pay rent, even his next meal, all of it now hinged on a broken-down mare that nobody wanted. We're in this together now, he whispered to Stella as they walked slowly toward his truck. I don't know if I just saved you or if we both just got sentenced. The mare's ears twitched slightly toward his voice, and for Jake, that tiny movement was enough, for now. The rumble of Jake's old pickup truck announced his return to Clearwater before he even reached the main street. He'd managed to rig a makeshift trailer to transport Stella, driving at a crawl the entire way to avoid jostling her weakened body. By the time he pulled up to Miller's General Store to grab some feed, a small crowd had already gathered. That the horse everyone's talking about? Earl Miller himself stepped out from behind the counter, wiping flour-covered hands on his apron. The 60-something store owner had been a friend of Jake's father and was one of the few people who occasionally extended the young man credit when times were especially tight. Her name's Stella, Jake said defensively, already bracing for the criticism. Sheriff Dan Holbrook, who happened to be in the store buying coffee, peered into the trailer. Jesus, boy, that animal's half dead. Blackwell sent you for a cow and you bring back this bag of bones. She needs care, is all, Jake insisted. She was a champion barrel racer. The Clayton mare. Recognition dawned on several faces. The Clayton family had been well-known breeders before they'd sold their operation and moved to Oklahoma. That's Lady Lightning. Mabel Carson, who ran the local diner, squinted at the emaciated horse. Lord, what happened to her? She was magnificent. Life happened to her, Jake replied quietly. I need some sweet feed, Earl. And maybe some electrolytes if you've got them. Earl hesitated. Jake, son, you know I don't like saying this, but are you sure about this? You've barely got enough to feed yourself, let alone nurse a broken-down horse back to health. Jake stiffened. I've got $300 left from what Blackwell gave me, which was supposed to be for a cow, Sheriff Holbrook pointed out, taking off his hat to wipe his brow. What exactly do you plan to tell your boss? The question hung in the air. Jake had been avoiding thinking about that particular problem for the entire drive home. The truth, he finally said, that I made a judgment call. Laughter erupted from the back of the crowd. Mike Delaney, one of the wealthier ranchers in the area, stepped forward. A judgment call? Boy, you pissed away your job is what you did. Blackwell's gonna have your hide. Maybe, Jake acknowledged, but I couldn't leave her there. He went inside and bought the feed, aware of the whispers following him. When he returned, he found Dr. Sarah Williams, the local veterinarian, examining Stella. Malnutrition, dehydration, neglected hooves, she listed clinically. Probably hasn't had proper worming in ages. Some old injuries that healed poorly. She looked at Jake with concern in her eyes. This is going to be expensive, Jake. I know. And time-consuming. And there's no guarantee she'll recover fully. I know that too. Dr. Williams sighed. Bring her by the clinic tomorrow. I'll do what I can at a discount. Your father would have done the same for any of us. That evening, Jake set up a small paddock beside his cabin, using the last of his fencing materials. Stella stood motionless in the center, head down, showing no interest in the fresh water or sweet feed Jake had placed nearby. It's okay, girl, he said softly, keeping his distance as his father had taught him with traumatized horses. No rush. No pressure. This is your space now. For hours, Jake sat on the ground nearby, reading aloud from his father's journal, letting Stella get used to his voice. As darkness fell, he noticed she had taken a few tentative sips of water. The next morning, Jake awoke to pounding on his door. Mr. Blackwell stood there, face flushed with anger. You had one job, Callahan, he growled. One simple job. Sir, I can explain. Save it. I heard all about your rescue mission. Blackwell looked past Jake to where Stella stood in the paddock. You've got till the end of the week to get a cow or clear out your locker. I don't pay for charity cases. After Blackwell drove off, Jake leaned against the doorframe, the weight of reality crashing down on him. Rusty nudged his hand supportively. What have I done, boy? Jake whispered. But when he looked out at Stella, standing a little straighter today, cautiously nibbling at some hay, he knew exactly what he'd done. He'd chosen his father's way, for better or worse. The small-town library of Clearwater wasn't much to look at. A single-story brick building with faded lettering and a perpetually squeaky front door. But to Jake, hunched over a microfiche reader in the back corner, it was a goldmine. After a grueling morning of mucking stalls at the Rockingby Ranch, he'd raced over during his lunch break. Finding anything? Mrs. Winters, the librarian who'd known Jake since he was a boy checking out horse books by the armful, placed a cup of coffee next to him. Not yet, Jake replied, scrolling through local newspaper archives. But she was famous once. There's got to be something. Mrs. Winters adjusted her reading glasses. Try the Western Horse Quarterly section. We kept all the regional equestrian publications. 20 minutes later, Jake sat back in his chair, staring at the image on the screen. There was Stella, Lady Lightning, in her prime. Gleaming white coat catching the arena lights. Powerful muscles rippling as she executed a perfect turn around a barrel. Atop her sat a rider in an expensive-looking Western shirt, his face captured in an expression of fierce determination. Edward Carter, Jake read aloud, scanning the article. 3-time state champion. Carter, Mrs. Winters frowned. That name's familiar. Jake continued reading, jotting notes in a small pad. Over the next hour, he pieced together Stella's story across dozens of articles. Edward Carter had purchased Lady Lightning as a 3-year-old from the Clayton breeding program. Together, they dominated the regional barrel racing circuit for 2 years. Then came the Southwestern Championship in Dallas, the biggest event of the season with a $50,000 prize. The final article made Jake's stomach clench. Favorite Lady Lightning falls in championship final, the headline read. The photo showed Stella stumbling around the last barrel while Carter yanked brutally at her mouth. Says here he was heavily favored to win. Jake murmured. Had placed large personal bets on his own victory. After that, Lady Lightning disappeared from the circuit. No more mentions, no more victories. That evening, as Jake carefully brushed Stella's dull coat, he spoke to her softly. So that's what happened, huh? You had one bad day, and he couldn't handle it. Stella had been with him for a week now. The progress was slow but noticeable. She'd gained a small amount of weight, and the fear in her eyes diminished slightly each day. Dr. Williams had treated her for parasites and was monitoring the healing of her hooves. Jake's phone rang. It was Mike Delaney, the wealthy rancher who'd laughed at him in town. Callahan, Delaney's gruff voice came through. My son says you're looking for information on a horse once owned by Edward Carter. Jake straightened. Yes, sir. I am. There's something you ought to know about Carter. He's not just some rodeo cowboy. Family owns half the oil fields between here and Odessa. Mean as a rattler and twice as dangerous when crossed. I appreciate the warning, Jake said carefully. But why are you telling me this? A long pause followed. Your daddy helped me once, years back. Had a valuable stallion with colic. No vet could get here in time. Thomas stayed up all night. Saved that horse when anyone else would have put him down. Another pause. I'm just returning the favor. Carter's bad news. Rumor has it he nearly beat that mare to death after the championship. Only reason he didn't finish the job was because some stable hands intervened. Jake's grip tightened on the phone. Do you know where Carter is now? Last I heard, he'd moved his operation to a big spread near Austin. But listen to me. Boy, you've got no business tangling with him. He's connected, powerful. After hanging up, Jake sat on the porch steps, watching Stella in the paddock. For the first time, she approached the fence where he sat, cautiously extending her neck. Hey there, he whispered, remaining perfectly still. Coming to say hello? Stella sniffed the air near him, nostrils flaring. Then, in a moment that made Jake's heart swell, she took a step closer and gently nudged his outstretched hand with her muzzle. That's it, Jake encouraged, tears stinging his eyes. Nobody's gonna hurt you again. I promise. Inside the cabin, Jake pulled out a map and circled Austin. In his heart, he knew this wasn't over. Someone who would abuse an animal the way Carter had abused Stella wouldn't simply walk away from what they considered their property, especially with their pride wounded. One day at a time, Jake reminded himself, watching Stella through the window as she took her first tentative trot across the paddock, testing her strengthening legs. Right now, healing is all that matters. But even as he said it, Jake felt a growing certainty that Edward Carter would eventually surface in Clearwater. And when he did, Jake would need to be ready. The first frost of autumn had just begun to crystallize on the grass when a black Range Rover with tinted windows pulled up outside Jake's cabin. In the 6 weeks since Jake had rescued Stella, the mare had made remarkable progress. Her coat had regained some of its luster, her ribs no longer protruded painfully beneath her skin, and she had begun to respond to gentle training. Each day, she grew more trusting, more like the champion she once had been. Jake was mucking out Stella's small stable when he heard the crunch of expensive tires on gravel. Setting down his pitchfork, he stepped outside, immediately wary of the vehicle that looked woefully out of place in Clearwater. A tall man in his 40s emerged from the driver's side. Despite the casual Western attire, designer jeans, ostrich skin boots, and a pressed button-down shirt, everything about him screamed wealth and power. His face was handsome in a hard way, weathered from years in the sun, with cold eyes that assessed Jake's modest property with unconcealed contempt. You Callahan? The man asked without preamble. Depends who's asking, Jake replied, instinctively positioning himself between the visitor and Stella's paddock. The man's mouth twisted into what might have passed for a smile. Edward Carter, I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his expression neutral. Don't know what you mean, sir. Carter reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. Lady Lightning, my mare, reported stolen 3 months ago. Imagine my surprise when I heard some ranch hand in a backwater town was keeping her. She wasn't stolen, Jake said evenly. I bought her legally at the Clearwater County Fair. Got the bill of sale to prove it. From Hank Dawson? He had no right to sell her. He was hired to transport her to my new facilities. Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice. Look, kid, I'm trying to be reasonable here. I'll give you what you paid for her, plus a little extra for your trouble. Jake stood his ground. She's not for sale. Carter's expression darkened. Do you have any idea who I am? I know exactly who you are, Mr. Carter. I've read all about you and Lady Lightning. About the championship in Dallas. At the mention of Dallas, Carter's face flushed with anger. You don't know shit, boy. That mare cost me 50 grand and my reputation. And that justified beating her half to death? Jake couldn't keep the disgust from his voice. A dangerous silence followed. Carter glanced toward the paddock where Stella had appeared, ears pricked forward curiously. You're making a mistake, Carter said softly. I've got paperwork proving ownership. Registration documents with the American Quarter Horse Association. Original bill of sale from Clayton Farms. He handed the folder to Jake, who reluctantly took it. Inside were indeed official-looking documents, including photographs of a much healthier Lady Lightning with Carter's name listed as owner. I could have the sheriff out here today, Carter continued, watching Jake scan the papers. But I'm willing to handle this privately. $10,000. That's what I'm offering. For a brief moment, Jake's resolve wavered. $10,000 would clear his parents' remaining medical bills. It would give him breathing room, maybe even enough to start the breeding program his father had dreamed of. But then Stella nickered softly from the paddock, and Jake remembered the way she'd flinched at sudden movements, the fear in her eyes that was only now beginning to fade. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Carter, Jake said, handing back the folder. But Stella, Lady Lightning, stays with me. Carter's expression hardened. Stella? You renamed my champion mare like some backyard pet. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Listen carefully, Callahan. I didn't come all this way to go home empty-handed. I've got friends in this county, in law enforcement, in the courts. One way or another, I'm taking my horse back. Then I guess we'll let the law decide, Jake replied, striving to keep his voice steady. Because the way I see it, you abandoned her. Left her to be sold off like garbage. Carter studied Jake for a long moment, then gave a cold laugh. You know what? I think I will go the legal route. Let's see how long you can afford to fight me in court on a ranch hand salary. He turned toward his car, then paused. Just remember, I offered to make this easy. As the Range Rover disappeared in a cloud of dust, Jake released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Stella had moved to the fence line, watching him with what almost seemed like concern. It's okay, girl, he said, running a trembling hand down her neck. We're not giving up without a fight. That evening, Jake made 2 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Williams, who had taken a special interest in Stella's recovery. He's back, Jake told her. And he's got paperwork. Forged, probably, Dr. Williams replied. I'll document all of Stella's injuries and treatment. If this goes to court, I'll testify to the condition she was in when you found her. The second call was to Adam Chun, a young lawyer who had returned to Clearwater after law school to take over his retiring father's practice. This won't be easy, Jake, Adam warned after hearing the story. Men like Carter have resources we can't match. But abandonment is abandonment. I'll see what I can do. As darkness fell, Jake sat on his porch steps, his father's journal open on his lap. A passage caught his eye. Sometimes doing right means standing alone. But standing alone for what's right is better than standing with a crowd for what's wrong. In the paddock, illuminated by the porch light, Stella dozed peacefully, unaware that the battle for her future had only just begun. The rumors spread through Clearwater faster than wildfire on a dry summer day. Jake Callahan was a horse thief. Jake Callahan had stolen a valuable mare from Edward Carter, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the state. Jake Callahan was going to end up in jail. It began subtly, sideways glances at the general store, conversations that halted when he entered the diner, credit suddenly unavailable at businesses where he'd been trusted for years. Just giving you a heads up, Sheriff Holbrook told Jake one afternoon, leaning against his patrol car outside Jake's cabin. Carter's been making calls. Lots of calls. Judge Reynolds had dinner with him last week at that fancy steakhouse in Austin. Jake tightened the fence he was repairing, driving the staple with more force than necessary. Thanks for letting me know. The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. Your daddy was my friend, Jake. I don't like seeing you caught up in this. Maybe consider Carter's offer. $10,000 is good money. It's not about the money, Jake replied, his jaw set. You saw the condition she was in. I did, Holbrook acknowledged. And between us, I think Carter's a first-class son of a bitch. But he's a powerful son of a bitch. Just be careful. 2 days later, Jake returned from work to find his mailbox smashed and a crude note nailed to his front door. Horse thieves get what they deserve. Adam Chun filed a countersuit, claiming Carter had abandoned Stella and forfeited his rights to her. The local paper ran a front-page story, with opinions in town quickly dividing between those who believed Jake was standing up for animal rights and those who thought he was foolish to challenge someone of Carter's stature. "You've become quite the celebrity," Mr. Blackwell remarked dryly as Jake loaded hay bales. Surprisingly, despite his initial anger, Blackwell hadn't fired him. "Carter called me yesterday, offered me $5,000 to let you go." Jake froze, and Blackwell spat tobacco juice onto the dirt. "Told him I don't take bribes. Your work's solid, even if your judgment's questionable. But don't make me regret it, Callahan." The physical attacks began a week later. Jake awoke to find 2 fence posts pulled up and Stella's water trough overturned. The next night, someone slashed his truck tires. A few days after that, sugar was poured into his gas tank. "They're trying to wear you down," Adam said when Jake reported the vandalism. "Make you desperate enough to settle." Jake spent his nights patrolling his small property with a flashlight and his father's old shotgun, catching sleep in broken hours during the day. The stress began to show, dark circles under his eyes, weight dropping from his already lean frame. Dr. Williams stopped by regularly to check on both Stella and Jake. "You can't keep this up," she warned. "You'll make yourself sick." "What choice do I have?" Jake asked, running a hand through his disheveled hair. One evening, as Jake brushed Stella, a ritual that had become therapeutic for them both, he heard a truck approaching. Tensing, he reached for the shotgun he now kept nearby, but relaxed slightly when he recognized Earl Miller's delivery vehicle. "Delivery for Callahan," Earl called, stepping out with a large box. "I didn't order anything," Jake said, confused. "Nope, but folks around town did." Earl opened the box to reveal feed, supplements, new fence staples, and a solar-powered security light. "Not everyone believes Carter's stories, son." Beneath the supplies was a card signed by a dozen townspeople, many of whom Jake barely knew. "Stand your ground," it read simply. That small gesture of support renewed Jake's determination, but Carter's forces were relentless. The following week, as Jake returned from the feed store, he found 3 men examining Stella's paddock. "Can I help you?" he asked, immediately suspicious. The largest of the men, a muscular figure with a shaved head and cold eyes, turned slowly. "Mr. Carter sent us to inspect his property. Make sure it's being properly maintained." "This is private property, and you're trespassing," Jake replied, his hand inching toward his pocket where he kept a small canister of pepper spray. "For now," the man sneered. "Courts might see things differently soon. Shame if anything happened to the horse before then." "Are you threatening me?" Jake stepped forward, anger overriding caution. The man smiled. "Just making conversation. Boys, I think we've seen enough." As they left, Jake noticed Stella pressed against the far corner of the paddock, trembling. One glance at her feed bucket revealed why. Someone had mixed in broken glass. That night, Jake called Adam. "I need a restraining order. They tried to hurt Stella today. I'll file first thing tomorrow," Adam promised. "Did you get their names?" "No, but I got their license plate." Later, after cleaning out Stella's feed area thoroughly, Jake sat with her in the paddock under the stars. For the first time, the mare rested her head against his shoulder, her breath warm and trusting. "I won't let them take you," he whispered fiercely. "No matter what." The restraining order was granted 2 days later, but Jake knew it was just paper. It wouldn't stop men who operated in shadows. Carter's tactics shifted from intimidation to isolation. Suddenly, Jake found himself unwelcome at local establishments. His bank mysteriously lost his account information. The garage claimed they couldn't get parts for his truck anymore. Through it all, Stella continued to improve, seemingly drawing strength from Jake's determination. Her coat gleamed, her eyes brightened, and one magical morning, Jake watched from the porch as she ran the length of the paddock, her stride powerful and smooth, head held high. A glimpse of the champion she had once been. That evening, Jake noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The weather report warned of severe thunderstorms moving into the region, the kind that could bring flash floods to the creek that ran behind his property. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, Jake secured the cabin and made sure Stella's shelter was reinforced. The wind picked up, bending the old oak trees that lined the property. "Going to be a rough one," he told Stella, making sure she had extra feed. but we'll be okay." He couldn't have known that the storm would be the least of their worries that night. Thunder cracked like a whip across the darkened Texas sky as rain pounded against Jake's cabin with unrelenting fury. The storm had intensified over the past hour, transforming the usually docile creek behind his property into a churning, angry torrent that crept steadily toward the barn where Stella was sheltered. Jake paced anxiously by the window, checking his phone periodically. No signal. The power had gone out 20 minutes earlier, leaving him with only a kerosene lamp and flashlight. Another violent thunderclap shook the cabin, and he made a decision. "Come on, Rusty," he called to the border collie, who was huddled nervously under the kitchen table. "We'd better check on her." Throwing on his rain slicker and grabbing the flashlight, Jake stepped out into the deluge. The wind nearly knocked him sideways as he fought his way toward the small barn, rain pelting his face like needles. The beam of his flashlight cut weakly through the darkness, illuminating sheets of water cascading off the barn roof. When he reached the barn door, he immediately sensed something was wrong. It was partially open, swinging violently in the wind. Jake was certain he had latched it securely earlier. "Stella," he called out, heart hammering as he pushed inside. The flashlight beam revealed an empty stall. Panic surged through him until a soft, nickering sound came from the back corner. There stood Stella, trembling but unharmed, pressed against the wall as far from the door as possible. Relief flooded through Jake, but it was short-lived. The sound of an engine gunning to life outside cut through the storm's roar. "Stay here, girl," he ordered, rushing back into the rain. His flashlight caught the outline of a horse trailer hitched to an unfamiliar pickup truck near the property line. 3 figures scrambled around it, shouting to each other over the storm. "Hey!" Jake bellowed, running toward them, Rusty barking furiously at his heels. One of the men turned. It was the shaved-headed thug who had threatened him days earlier. "Grab him!" he shouted to his companions. Before Jake could react, a second man tackled him from the side, sending him crashing into the mud. The flashlight went flying, its beam spinning crazily before extinguishing. Jake felt a fist connect with his jaw, tasting blood as he struggled against his attacker. Rusty lunged at the man, teeth sinking into his arm. The man howled in pain, releasing Jake momentarily. "Get the damn dog," the leader shouted, moving toward the barn. Jake scrambled to his feet, adrenaline overriding pain. "You're not taking her." "The hell I'm not," the man growled, brandishing what looked like a cattle prod. "Carter wants his horse, and he's gonna get her. Tonight." Jake charged, catching the larger man off guard. They both went down hard, wrestling in the mud as rain poured over them. Despite giving everything he had, Jake was outmatched. The man pinned him, pressing his face into the muddy ground. "Should have taken the money, kid," he taunted, his weight crushing Jake's chest. A sudden flash of lightning revealed another figure rushing toward them. Sheriff Holbrook, shotgun in hand. "Police! Freeze!" the sheriff bellowed over the storm. The man hesitated just long enough for Jake to throw him off and scramble away. The other 2 attackers were already heading for the truck. "Don't move, Peterson," Holbrook ordered, training his shotgun on the leader. "Your buddies are about to find my deputies waiting at the road." The man called Peterson slowly raised his hands, fury etched on his face. In the distance, the sound of sirens pierced through the storm's wail. "You okay, son?" Holbrook asked, not taking his eyes off the suspect. Jake nodded, wiping blood from his split lip. "How did you know?" "Anonymous call to the station. Said Carter's men were planning to retrieve property tonight during the storm." Holbrook's expression hardened. "Guess they figured the weather would cover their tracks." Later, after Peterson and his accomplices had been taken away in patrol cars, Jake sat on his porch steps with a blanket around his shoulders. The rain had finally slackened, though lightning still flickered intermittently across the distant sky. Dr. Williams, who had arrived shortly after the sheriff, finished examining a cut above Jake's eye. "You'll have a nice shiner tomorrow, but nothing's broken," she concluded, packing away her first aid kit. "Thanks for coming out," Jake said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the storm. When the sheriff called, he said you might need medical attention. "I didn't realize he meant for both you and Stella." She glanced toward the barn, where Stella was now safely secured. "She's remarkably calm, considering what happened. Shows how much she trusts you." Sheriff Holbrook approached, removing his rain-soaked hat. "Peterson's singing like a canary. Says Carter hired them to bring the horse to his ranch in Austin tonight. Paid $5,000 up front with another $5,000 on delivery. Will they testify against him? Jake asked eagerly. Maybe. Holbrook sighed. Carter's already called the county commissioner. His lawyer's probably waking up a judge for bail as we speak. So they'll be out by morning, Jake said bitterly. Likely, but we've got them on trespassing, attempted theft, and assault. And now we've got evidence linking it all back to Carter. As the night wore on, more townsfolk arrived. Earl Miller with hot coffee and sandwiches, Adam Chun to document everything for their court case, and surprisingly, Mr. Blackwell, who surveyed the scene with grudging respect. Heard they roughed you up pretty good, Blackwell commented, handing Jake a thermos of what turned out to be whiskey-laced coffee. I've had worse, Jake replied, though his aching body disagreed. Blackwell grunted. You're as stubborn as your old man. He looked toward the barn. Must be some horse. She is. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of fallen branches and swollen creeks. Jake stood in Stella's stall, gently stroking her neck. The mare nuzzled his shoulder, seemingly understanding how close she had come to being taken. Word of the night's events spread quickly through Clearwater. By midday, townspeople were stopping by with offers of help to repair storm damage. Some who had been cool to Jake just days before now expressed outrage at Carter's tactics. It's turning, Adam observed as they watched volunteers reinforcing the barn. Public opinion. Carter's showing his true colors, and people don't like it. Jake nodded, too exhausted for words. For the first time since Carter had appeared in his driveway, he felt something close to hope. The fight was far from over, but he was no longer fighting alone. That evening, as sunset painted the rain-washed sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Jake led Stella to the paddock. Despite the bruises on his face and the ache in his ribs, he felt a strange peace watching her trot confidently around the enclosure, stopping occasionally to gaze at him with those intelligent eyes. We made it through the storm, girl, he told her softly. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together. In the distance, the telephone rang inside his cabin, Adam with news about their court date. The real battle was about to begin. The Clearwater County Courthouse stood as an imposing limestone monument to justice at the center of town, its weathered facade having witnessed generations of disputes, marriages, property transfers, and occasional criminal proceedings. Today, however, the building was surrounded by an unusual crowd. Local ranchers in their best Stetsons, animal rights activists with handmade signs, and reporters from as far away as Houston and Dallas. Quite the circus, Adam Chun remarked as he and Jake made their way up the courthouse steps. At 28, Adam was the youngest attorney in the county, but what he lacked in gray hair, he made up for in meticulous preparation and fierce dedication. Jake nodded nervously, adjusting the borrowed tie that felt like a noose around his neck. He'd spent his last dollars on the only suit he owned, a navy blue ensemble from the department store in the next county over. Beside him walked Dr. Williams, carrying a thick folder of medical records and photographs documenting Stella's condition. Inside, the courtroom was already packed. Jake spotted Sheriff Holbrook, Earl Miller, and several other supporters seated behind the plaintiff's table. On the other side sat Edward Carter, impeccably dressed in what was certainly a custom suit, flanked by not one but 3 attorneys in equally expensive attire. Remember, Adam whispered as they took their seats, Carter's strategy is to make this about property law. Our job is to make it about animal welfare and abandonment. Judge Eleanor Reeves, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for no-nonsense proceedings, entered the courtroom. All rise, called the bailiff, and the proceedings began. Carter's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named James Harrington from a prestigious Austin firm, presented their case first. He spoke with practiced precision, displaying the original ownership documents, registration papers, and emphasizing Carter's status as a respected breeder and competitor. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of property recovery, Harrington concluded smoothly. Mr. Carter's champion mare, valued at over $50,000, was sold without authorization by an individual who had no right to transfer ownership. Mr. Callahan purchased stolen property, and while he may have acted in ignorance, that does not entitle him to retain possession of an animal that legally belongs to my client. When Adam rose to present their defense, Jake felt his heart racing. So much rode on these next moments, not just Stella's future, but his own as well. He'd invested everything in this fight, financially and emotionally. "Your Honor," Adam began, his voice steady despite his youth, "this case is not about the recovery of property. It's about the willful abandonment and mistreatment of a living creature, and about a man who stepped in when no one else would." Adam methodically laid out their case. Carter had abandoned Stella after her performance declined, leaving her with Hank Dawson, who was instructed to get rid of her rather than transport her to new facilities as Carter now claimed. He presented affidavits from 2 former stable hands who had witnessed Carter's abuse of the mare after losing the championship. "And now," Adam continued, "I'd like to call Dr. Sarah Williams to testify regarding the condition of the animal when Mr. Callahan acquired her." Dr. Williams took the stand, presenting a clinical but devastating account of Stella's condition. She showed photographs that made many in the courtroom wince: the protruding ribs, the untreated wounds, the fear in the mare's eyes. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Williams stated firmly, "this animal was subjected to severe neglect, bordering on abuse. Without Mr. Callahan's intervention, she likely would have died within weeks from malnutrition and untreated health issues." Carter's attorneys objected repeatedly, trying to exclude the most damning evidence, but Judge Reeves allowed most of it. Jake noticed Carter's confident expression beginning to falter as the testimony continued. When Jake himself took the stand, Harrington's cross-examination was brutal. "Mr. Callahan, isn't it true that you were sent to purchase a cow with your employer's money?" "Yes, sir. And instead, you decided to spend that money on this horse." "I did. So you misappropriated funds entrusted to you for a specific purpose?" Adam objected, and Judge Reeves sustained, but the implication hung in the air. "Mr. Callahan, have you ever formally trained as a veterinarian or equine specialist?" "No, sir. But my father." "Yes or no answers, please." "So you have no professional qualifications to determine an animal's condition or appropriate care?" "No, but thank you, Mr. Callahan. That will be all." Jake stepped down, feeling as though he'd failed. But then came the witnesses who turned the tide. Hank Dawson, the livestock dealer who confessed that Carter had instructed him to dump the worthless nag for whatever he could get. Julie Mendez, a former stable hand who tearfully described Carter's rage after losing the championship. And most surprisingly, Mike Delaney, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county. "I've known Edward Carter for 15 years, Delaney testified, his weathered face solemn. "Seen how he treats animals that don't perform to his standards. That boy," he nodded toward Jake, "did what any decent horseman would have done." During a recess, Carter approached Jake outside the courtroom. "50,000, he offered in a low voice, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Cash, today. Drop the case, sign over the mare." Jake stared at him, momentarily speechless. It was a fortune, enough to clear his debts, maybe even buy a small piece of land of his own. "Mr. Carter," he finally replied, "there isn't enough money in Texas." Carter's face darkened. "You're making a mistake, Callahan. Even if you win today, you've made an enemy for life." The final day of the hearing brought closing arguments. Harrington emphasized property rights and the value of the horse, while Adam focused on abandonment and Jake's moral obligation to rescue a suffering animal. "Your Honor," Adam concluded, "this case is about more than who holds a piece of paper. It's about who acted as a true steward of this animal." Edward Carter abandoned Lady Lightning when she no longer served his purposes. Jake Callahan saved Stella when she needed him most. The law must recognize and reward that kind of compassion, not punish it. Judge Reeves took 2 days to render her decision. When the courtroom reassembled, Jake could barely breathe as she adjusted her glasses and began reading. "This court finds that while Mr. Carter did initially have legal ownership of the mare known as Lady Lightning, his subsequent actions constituted abandonment under Texas livestock statutes. By instructing his agent to dispose of the animal for any price, with no concern for her welfare or future care, Mr. Carter effectively relinquished his property rights." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Carter sat rigidly in his chair, his expression frozen. Furthermore, Judge Reeves continued, "Evidence presented regarding the animal's treatment while in Mr. Carter's possession is deeply troubling. This court hereby grants full ownership of the mare now known as Stella to Mr. Jacob Callahan, with no compensation owed to the plaintiff." She paused, looking directly at Carter over her reading glasses. Additionally, this court is referring evidence of animal cruelty to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Mr. Carter is hereby prohibited from purchasing or owning equines within this county for a period of 5 years. The gavel fell with finality. Jake sat stunned as Adam shook his hand vigorously. Around him, supporters patted his back and offered congratulations. Through tears of relief, he watched Carter storm out of the courtroom, his attorneys scrambling to follow. Outside, reporters peppered Jake with questions, but he could barely form coherent answers. All he wanted was to get home to Stella, to tell her that she was truly his now, that no one could take her away. That evening, as sunset painted the Texas sky in brilliant gold and crimson, Jake sat on the fence of Stella's paddock. The mare approached freely, resting her head against his chest in what had become their nightly ritual. "We did it, girl," he whispered, stroking her white mane. "You're home for good." As darkness fell, Jake realized that for the first time in months, he could sleep without fear, the fear that had been his constant companion since the day he'd brought Stella home from the fair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, at least, justice had prevailed. The late October sunshine bathed Clearwater in golden light as Jake led Stella from her paddock for their morning exercise. 3 months had passed since the courthouse victory, and both horse and owner had undergone remarkable transformations. Stella's white coat now gleamed with health, her eyes bright and alert, her once gaunt frame filled out with lean muscle. She moved with the fluid grace of the champion she had once been, showing no traces of her previous injuries. Jake, too, had changed. The strain and worry that had aged him beyond his years had lifted, replaced by quiet confidence. The victory against Carter had earned him respect throughout the community, transforming him from that poor Callahan boy to a young man of principle who had stood his ground against overwhelming odds. "Looking good, you two," Dr. Williams called, pulling her truck up Jake's freshly graveled driveway. She visited less frequently now that Stella was fully recovered, but still stopped by weekly to check on her favorite patient. "Just about to take her for a run," Jake replied, patting Stella's gleaming neck. "Want to watch?" "Wouldn't miss it," Dr. Williams smiled, leaning against her truck. Jake swung himself onto Stella's back, no saddle, just a simple bridle, and they took off across the small pasture behind his cabin. The trust between them was palpable as Stella responded to the slightest shifts in Jake's weight, changing direction with barely perceptible cues. They moved as one entity, racing the wind. "She's magnificent," Dr. Williams said when they returned. "Hard to believe she's the same horse." "Some days I can hardly believe it myself," Jake admitted, dismounting and offering Stella an apple from his pocket, which she took with delicate precision. Inside the cabin, Dr. Williams accepted a cup of coffee and settled at Jake's small kitchen table. The interior had undergone its own transformation. New curtains, a repaired roof, and fresh paint gave the space a sense of permanence it had lacked before. "Heard anything more about Carter?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "Adam says the animal cruelty charges were settled out of court. Hefty fine, community service, and the ban on horse ownership was extended statewide for 10 years. Small price to pay, Dr. Williams observed. "Maybe, but his reputation in the circuit is ruined. That probably hurts him more than any fine could." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Dr. Williams broached the subject she'd come to discuss. "Jake, I've been thinking. You've got a gift with horses, especially troubled ones. I get calls all the time about abused or neglected animals that need rehabilitation before they can be rehomed." Jake listened as she outlined her idea, a small-scale rescue operation focusing on horses that others had given up on. Dr. Williams would provide veterinary care at reduced rates, and her network of contacts could help with funding and adoption. "It's just something to consider," she finished. "You've done wonders with Stella. Seems a shame to limit that talent to just one horse." After she left, Jake sat on his porch, turning the idea over in his mind. The thought had occurred to him as well, especially after several people had approached him at the feed store asking for advice with their own troubled horses. His finances, while still tight, had improved. Mr. Blackwell had given him a modest raise, impressed by his dedication during the trial. The local newspaper had paid him to write a short weekly column about horse care, and a neighboring rancher had offered him weekend work training young quarter horses. That evening, as Jake prepared for bed, he spotted his father's journal on the nightstand. Opening it to a random page, he read, "Every horse deserves at least one person who sees the potential beneath the problems. Be that person whenever you can." The words, written years ago, felt like both blessing and directive. The next morning, Jake called Dr. Williams. "I want to do it," he told her. "Start small, maybe just 1 or 2 horses at a time, but I want to try." Within weeks, the word had spread. A local carpenter volunteered to help Jake expand the small barn, adding 2 more stalls. Earl Miller offered credit at the store for feed and supplies. Even Sheriff Holbrook pitched in, organizing a group of deputies to help repair and extend the fencing around Jake's property. The first rescue arrived in early December. A nervous Appaloosa gelding named Domino, who had been confined to a too-small pen for years, developing both physical and behavioral problems. Jake worked with him patiently, using the techniques he developed with Stella. By Christmas, Domino was allowing himself to be touched without flinching. The second was a blind quarter-horse mare abandoned when her owner died. The family had planned to euthanize her until Dr. Williams suggested Jake might be able to help. Despite her blindness, the mare, whom Jake named Faith, learned to navigate her surroundings with remarkable accuracy, guided by voice commands and the companionship of Domino, who seemed to appoint himself as her protector. Local children began stopping by after school to watch Jake work with the horses. Soon, he was giving informal lessons in basic horsemanship, emphasizing gentleness and respect for the animals. One crisp January morning, as Jake was mucking out stalls, a familiar truck pulled up. Mr. Blackwell stepped out, surveying the modest but growing operation with appraising eyes. "Got a proposition for you, Callahan," he said without preamble. "Ranch is getting to be too much for me these days. Thinking of scaling back, keeping just the house and 10 acres for myself." Jake leaned on his pitchfork, listening cautiously. "Been watching what you're doing here," Blackwell continued. "It's good work. Important work." He cleared his throat awkwardly. "Your father would have been proud." Coming from the taciturn rancher, the words carried special weight. "I'm offering you first option on the south parcel. 40 acres, includes the old foreman's house and the small stable. Needs work, but the bones are good." Jake's heart raced. "Mr. Blackwell, I can't afford." "Didn't mention a price yet, did I?" Blackwell interrupted. "I'm offering owner financing. Small down payment, reasonable monthly terms." He looked away, as if embarrassed by his own generosity. "World needs more folks who care about animals the way you do." That night, Jake sat with Stella in her stall, talking through the decision as he often did. The mare listened attentively, ears pricked forward as if understanding every word. "It's a risk," he told her, smoothing her forelock. "A big one. But it feels right, doesn't it?" Stella nudged his chest gently, her soft breath warm against his neck. 2 days later, Jake signed the preliminary papers on Blackwell's property. The small down payment nearly emptied his savings, but as he walked the land, his land, with Stella beside him, Jake felt a sense of rightness that transcended financial concerns. The old foreman's house was indeed in need of repair, but it was twice the size of his cabin, with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides and views of rolling pastureland. The stable, though weathered, was solidly built and could house up to 8 horses with proper renovation. That evening, Jake sat on the porch steps of what would soon be his new home, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in spectacular shades of orange and purple. Stella grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally raising her head to check on him. "This is just the beginning, girl," he told her softly. "Just the beginning of what we can do together." As if in response, Stella trotted over and pressed her velvet muzzle against his shoulder, a gesture that had become her way of expressing affection. In her intelligent eyes, Jake saw not just the painful past they had overcome together, but the promising future that now stretched before them, a future built on second chances and the healing power of compassion. Spring arrived in Texas with an explosion of wildflowers transforming the landscape into a colorful canvas. Bluebonnets, Indian paintbrushes, and Mexican hats dotted the rolling pastures of what was now officially Second Chance Ranch. The hand-painted sign at the entrance, created by the art class from Clearwater High School, featured a silhouette of a running white horse, a tribute to the mare who had started it all. Jake stood on the porch of the renovated foreman's house, now his home, marveling at how much had changed in a year. The property buzzed with activity, volunteers mucking stalls, a farrier working on a rescued Palomino's hooves, and Dr. Williams examining a recently arrived Arabian with severe trust issues. "Morning, boss," called Miguel Rodriguez, a former rodeo rider who had become Jake's first full-time employee. "That new feed shipment just arrived. Where do you want it?" "Stack it in the west barn for now," Jake replied. "And can you check on Spirit?" Sarah thought his cough was improving yesterday. Jake watched as Miguel headed toward the quarantine paddock where Spirit, a black Mustang rescued from a neglect case, was recovering from respiratory issues. The ranch now housed 12 permanent residents and had capacity for another 8 rehabilitation cases. Each horse had its own story of abuse, neglect, or abandonment, and each was responding to the specialized care program Jake had developed. "Impressive what you've built here," came a familiar voice from behind him. Jake turned to find Adam Chun climbing the porch steps, legal briefcase in hand. The young attorney had become a close friend over the past year, handling the legal aspects of establishing Second Chance as a registered nonprofit organization. "Just got the final paperwork approved," Adam announced, patting the briefcase. "You're officially a 501c3. Donations will be tax-deductible now." "That's great news," Jake said, leading Adam inside where coffee was brewing. The interior of the house reflected Jake's unpretentious style: comfortable furniture, photos of rescue horses lining the walls, and books on equine behavior stacked on nearly every surface. As they sat at the kitchen table reviewing the documents, Jake's mind drifted back to the journey that had brought him here. From the desperate young ranch hand struggling to survive to the director of a growing horse sanctuary, the transformation seemed almost unbelievable. "Penny for your thoughts?" Adam asked, noticing Jake's distraction. "Just thinking about where it all started. If I hadn't gone to that fair, if I hadn't seen Stella that day." Jake shook his head. One small decision changed everything. As if summoned by her name, Stella appeared at the kitchen window, her white head peering in curiously. At 8 years old, she was in her prime, strong, healthy, and serving as the unofficial ambassador of the ranch. Whenever new horses arrived, Stella seemed to sense their fear and would often position herself in an adjacent paddock, her calm presence helping to settle the newcomers. "Speaking of life-changing decisions," Adam said, sliding a newspaper across the table, "Seen this?" Jake glanced at the headline: "Carter Equestrian Empire Faces Bankruptcy." The article detailed how Edward Carter's business had collapsed following the animal cruelty scandal, with investors and sponsors pulling out one by one. "I don't take any pleasure in his downfall," Jake said honestly, "but I hope it means fewer horses will suffer." After Adam left, Jake made his afternoon rounds, checking on each horse personally. There was Winston, an ex-racehorse with a bowed tendon; Luna, a mare rescued from an illegal rodeo operation; Thunder, an elderly draft horse abandoned when he could no longer pull heavy loads; and a dozen others, each with their own personality and needs. The most recent arrival was a 3-year-old quarter horse with severe anxiety named Cody. Jake approached his stall slowly, speaking in the gentle, consistent tone that had become his trademark. Cody backed into the corner, trembling slightly. "It's all right, boy," Jake murmured. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." He didn't enter the stall or attempt to touch the horse. That would come later, when Cody was ready. Instead, Jake simply sat on a stool outside the stall, opened his father's journal, and began reading aloud as he did with all new arrivals. The sound of his steady voice often helped frightened horses acclimate to human presence without pressure. Later that afternoon, as the Texas sun began its descent, Jake led a group of visitors on a tour of the facility. These monthly open houses had become an important part of the ranch's outreach and fundraising efforts. "This is Stella," Jake explained as they reached the special paddock near the main house, where his first rescue now enjoyed a life of comfort and dignity. "She's the reason all of this exists." As if understanding she was being discussed, Stella trotted over to the fence, allowing the visitors to admire her, a far cry from the terrified, abused mare she had once been. "The transformation is remarkable," commented an older woman in the group. "Both hers and yours, young man." Jake looked at her questioningly. "I was in the courthouse that day," she explained. "Watched a boy stand up to a powerful man because it was the right thing to do. Now look what's grown from that." After the visitors departed, Jake found himself alone with Stella in the paddock as twilight softened the landscape. She nuzzled his shoulder in their familiar greeting. "We did good, didn't we, girl?" he asked softly, running his hand along her neck. The sound of a vehicle approaching drew his attention. A battered pickup truck stopped at the gate, and a teenage girl climbed out, looking nervous. In the truck bed was a small horse trailer. Jake walked over to meet her, Stella following at his heels. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Are you Mr. Callahan?" the girl asked, her voice quavering slightly. "My name's Emma. I heard about what you do here." Jake nodded encouragingly. "I've got this pony," she continued, gesturing toward the trailer. "Belonged to my little sister before she got sick. Nobody's had time to care for him properly, and he's getting kind of mean now. Dad says we need to get rid of him, but I can't bear the thought of him going to auction." Jake recognized the desperation in her eyes, the same desperate hope he'd felt standing at that fair a year ago. "Why don't we take a look at him?" Jake suggested gently. The pony in the trailer was indeed in rough shape, underweight, hooves overgrown, coat dull with neglect. But his eyes were bright and intelligent, watching Jake warily as he approached. "What's his name?" Jake asked. "Sparky," Emma replied. "I don't have much money, but I've been saving from my after-school job. I can pay something toward his care." Jake thought for a moment, then made a decision. "We'll take him, Emma. And instead of money, how about you come volunteer here on weekends? You can help with his rehabilitation, learn how to properly care for horses." The relief and gratitude on the girl's face reminded Jake powerfully of his own journey, how one act of compassion had created ripples that continued to spread outward. That evening, after Sparky was settled in a comfortable stall with fresh water and good hay, Jake sat on his porch with Rusty dozing at his feet. The stars emerged in the vast Texas sky, and the soft nickering of contented horses drifted from the barn. He opened his father's journal, turning to the last page where Thomas Callahan had written, "A life well lived leaves something behind, something that makes the world a little kinder, a little more just. Find that something, son, and pour your heart into it." Jake looked out at the ranch, at the safe haven that had grown from one impulsive purchase, one desperate rescue. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new horses needing help, new battles to fight on behalf of animals who couldn't speak for themselves. But tonight, under a canopy of stars, with Stella grazing peacefully nearby, Jake Callahan knew he had found his purpose. The legacy his father had spoken of wasn't about wealth or fame or power. It was about compassion and action, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. It was about second chances, for Stella, for the dozens of other horses who had found refuge here, and for Jake himself. As if sensing his thoughts, Stella raised her head, her white coat luminous in the moonlight. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that silent exchange was everything that needed to be said, a promise kept, a life transformed, and a future full of possibility. Second Chance Ranch was more than a place. It was a living testament to what could grow from a single act of compassion, a legacy that would continue to touch lives, both equine and human, for years to come. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched the whole thing," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's super emotional.